I believe I'm inaugurating a session on conflict. But let me tell you, I don't want to talk about conflict in order to perpetuate conflict. My idea is that conflict should be resolved so that we can have peace. When we talk about peace, we talk about continuing peace. When we talk about conflict, we don't talk about continuing conflict. We want conflict to be resolved, we want peace to descend, and we want happier times for everybody. Now, we have all been witness to a number of ethnic carnages, or riots as popularly called, in different parts of India. And I suppose we're all here because we are pained by those incidents. And I've noticed something which was a flaw perhaps in my own training and in my own studies. I never really followed people who were victims of riots after the event had happened, much after the event had happened. Usually, we are studying them around the time this terrible bloodshed occurred, around the time when they go through this trauma, which is ghastly. And then, as time goes on, we probably move on to other riots, other issues, other problems, and we tend to forget what happened to the victims, or what happens to victims over time. So, with that in mind, I felt I should return to Bombay and to Ahmedabad to examine the lives of those whom we left behind in 1993 and 2002 respectively. So that was the reason why I went there. I also want to know, in a more academic vein, how do people establish normalcy? What is the meaning of leading a normal life? Indeed, what is normalcy all about? And this is another issue that I thought should be looked at, because if we can piece together our notion of normalcy through the crisis, then perhaps we'll have a better understanding of normalcy itself, because in sociology we are told that you get to know your phenomena better if you look at it in the extremes. And this is an extreme situation, and maybe by studying extremes we can understand the normal more closely than if you study only the normal all the time. When I began the study, as you know, we all believe that generally, unthinkingly perhaps, uncritically perhaps, but not really something that I should point a finger at anybody. But when people go through these terrible times, there are three issues that really come up. One is, well, they've lost their jobs, most of them. So the economic factor is uppermost. The children don't go to school. It's another big problem. Women have been outraged. What about their psychological well-being? And then we also have this lingering fear that as so much injustice has been done to them, they will probably revert to some kind of fundamentalism. And that is going to be here with us to stay and spoil the democratic content of our secular lives. So these are the three things that most of us come away with in the immediate aftermath of a bloody carnage. We are worried about them, we wonder what will happen to the jobs, they don't have jobs, the children don't go to school, the women are terrified of even stepping out of their homes, and the other one, big fear, the long duration fear, is that will they all turn fundamentalists? If they all turn fundamentalists, then what will we do? So I looked at these issues closely, and I'm not saying that I succeeded in all of them, but I do think that at the end of the day, I came back sadder but wiser man. In the sense I realized that some of the things that we thought were so important in those days are not that important any longer. Some other issues are. And we don't pay enough attention to those issues, which I think we should, if we want to bring about peace in the long run and ride over this moment of conflict. So my big lessons were in the area of education, in the area of jobs and the economic sphere, and in the area of what is the role of clerics or the role of ideology, of religion, on those who've been outraged during the riots. And I feel that if we look at these three issues, the economic aspect, the educational aspect, and the ideological aspect of religion, if we look at them closely, you will find, and I hope to demonstrate that to you today, you already know it, we'll find that what really unites them together is the cause of justice. It is justice that unites these three themes together, that of economic well-being, of education, and of the attitude towards religion, religious fundamentalists or religious specialists, virtuosos, clerics, etc. These three actually find some kind of unity in the theme called justice. But why should justice bother us so much after all? The world is unjust. There have been long moments in history where people have been unjust and thrived on it. Why should we bother about justice? Why not take this as another sad chapter in the history of humankind and let's forget about it and move on? But why do we need to talk about justice? What is the compelling reason for that? And I think there's only one compelling reason, and this is the act of faith, whether you like it or not. But you have to take that step. There's only one compelling reason why we must talk about justice, and that is because we've decided to be a democratic society. Had we not decided to be a democratic society, I don't think justice would be on the agenda the way it is today. Democracy enjoins upon us to look at all of these issues through the optic of justice. Second, in this process, we'll also come face to face with how people lead ordinary everyday lives. Talcott Parsons, a scholar whom I used to routinely look down upon because of the fact that he was supposed to be an anti-Marxist, non-Marxist or whatever, said once, and I remember that line very clearly, he said that society is a powder keg of diverse forces. And the real challenge of sociology is to understand how, in spite of it being a powder keg of diverse forces, society still coheres. That is the challenge. To say that society is going to crumble tomorrow, or that there are all these conflicting elements in society, therefore it won't last for long, is easier to establish than to examine why does a society continue even though there are so many things against it, and use the phrase powder keg, I think, very appropriately. It is a powder keg, you're sitting on it, and if for some reason, if you're lucky, it won't blow up in our face. So that is one important feature that stayed with me. The second is a study of everyday life, which is called life world or habitus or whatever. You have Bourdieu, you have Habermas, who talk about it in different ways. And I felt that what should be now brought into their works, into the corpus of their work, very extensive and very impressive. And what often escapes a very quick thinker or reader of these books is that you just don't come to the life world or habitus or the hum of everyday life routinely. It has to be negotiated. There's a negotiation going on all the time. And there's this negotiation that we often overlook when we take these terms very simply, lightly, and superficially. Everyday life is full of negotiations. There's tolerance and there's suspicion. There's also kind of antagonism that we learn to live with. The boundaries we know we should not transgress. And should those boundaries be transgressed, we know there'll be trouble. And all of this, in a sense, you might say is untheorized. I'm using Habermas's word. They may be untheorized, but there's something there are things that are very consciously in our minds. And we take care not to do those things, lest they bring about social disharmony in our personal lives as well. So in this everyday life, let us not be rather romantic about it. It's not an idyllic situation. It is, however, a situation where people have come to terms with a negotiated normal. The normal is a negotiated one. And this negotiation is of critical importance. And every now and then, this negotiated normal undergoes some kind of a shock. And when it undergoes a shock, then how do we come back to another normal, another new normal? Because what every sociologist will tell you, that we cannot live with uncertainty every day. This is a human condition. In human condition, people cannot live with uncertainty. We must know certain things are going to happen with some degree of certitude. Otherwise, we'll find difficulty to open our doors and step out in the streets if things are so uncertain. So uncertainty has to be somehow tamed. Chaos has to be controlled. And therefore, we have to somehow re-establish a normal life. But that normal that we knew so well, at least the victims knew so well, that normal has been severely shattered. And therefore, what do? How do we come up with a new one? And this is, I think, an important area of study, but we can make some advance in it, provided we accept the fact that the existing normal is not really one of congeniality all the way. that there are elements or very important elements of tension which are negotiated. We come to terms with them, but they're there nevertheless. As I was telling you, very often in sociological theory and political theory too, there is this casual admission, and I think that is rather dangerous, which suggests that in the past we were all living in conviviality, in harmony, and in each other's arms. And that Hindus and Muslims were great friends, so were Sikhs and Hindus, name any community. They were all together. It is modernity that spoiled everything. And to some extent, I blame people like Bourdieu and Habermas for encouraging this point of view, because most people, me included, don't read texts very closely. And therefore we come away with impressions that we should not come away with, but nevertheless they are there, and to some extent you can trace them to the writings of these scholars. The fact is that medieval India, ancient India, saw terrible killings, brutal massacres of thousands by people whom we sometimes adore as great figures of history. Even they have feet of clay and they are red in tooth and claw. But we don't accept those things, because what happens really is that it takes hundreds of years sometimes for a defeated community to stand up again. And in these 300 years, we believe there is peace because there's been no bloodshed. But that is a medieval peace. It's a medieval peace because there's no war. In the past, in medieval India, when people had to move upwards horizontally, it was always through bloodshed. As a poet said, you sort of waded through slaughter to a throne. And that's how things happened. So for hundreds of years, there was no slaughter. The throne was perfectly intact. And as long as you behaved and you observed the rules and regulations of the victor, the vanquished are allowed to lead a sort of peaceable life. But that is a medieval peace. You could have that. That's possible. In which case, we should not talk of justice the way we're talking today. We are talking about justice today because we no longer are interested in the medieval peace. We're interested in a democratic peace. And that is what forces us to examine issues which are democratic in nature, which compel us to look at the law as a public space. When the minority is attacked, have you noticed the strange kind of dichotomy? When the minority is attacked, it responds in a certain way. When the majority community attacks, it gives justification for its deeds in a certain way. The majority community always claims to be expressing the will and voice of the people, quote unquote. We the people are special. We have our own defining features. And these defining features, mind you, didn't come up overnight. They're part of history, culture, language, religion, geography, everything. So layer upon layer of these attributes are imbricated, such that at the end of the day, we are weighted by all these considerations, all these cultural markers that tell us who we are. It's the community that marks us out from other communities. We are the people. So when we say we the people of India, we can often slip into this kind of understanding that we the people of India are defined because of our history, geography, religion, etc., etc. Something that even Jawaharlal Nehru in his discovery of India seemed to allude, and I think that was a bit of a disappointment for me when he said that we are Indians because there are hills to the north, deep seas to the south, we have religious festivities which everybody observes across the country, there's a Ramayana taking place in different parts of India, and therefore we are one. And he picks up the soil and says, we are one, we are Indians. Well, that's people of India. And in every riot that I've studied 3 killings at close quarters. I'm not talking about some sporadic incident here and there, but 3 sustained campaigns. One in Bhiwandi, the 6 in Delhi, and this one in Gujarat in 2002. In all 3 I found that the people who attack the minority, they attack in the name of the people. We are the true Indians. But the minority respond in a strange way. They don't say we are a community of Muslims. They don't say we are a community of Sikhs. Their first response is we are citizens of the country. They always respond in the language of citizenship, always. And if you look at what they've been asking for, whether it's Sikhs or Muslims in Bhiwandi or in Meerut or in Ahmedabad, you'll find that they always ask for justice to be delivered, not along the lines of retribution, but according to the laws of the land. They don't say eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. They don't ask for medieval justice, but they ask for justice along the lines of citizenship, which I think is very important. And it sometimes, makes me feel uncomfortable, a chill running up my spine, when I remember that one of the largest resettlement colonies in Ahmedabad for Muslims who had been attacked in 2002, one of the largest resettlement colony in Ahmedabad is called Citizen Nagar. They've called it Citizen Nagar. It's kind of to symbolically remind the world that we Muslims who've been hurt and victimized and tortured, brutalized, everything terrible done to us, we are citizens. And if you were to go to Citizen Nagar, you'd be appalled at the conditions of their lives. Because not only do they harbor this memory, this grievous memory, but the living conditions there are dreadful. I've lived in slums, I've been to slums, but I tell you, when I went to Citizen Nagar, I thought this was the limit. Nothing could be worse than that. You were afraid to open your mouth, there's some debris float into it. It is built next to Ahmedabad's, or probably one of India's largest rubbish dumps. They're hardly 200 meters from this site, where row upon row of one-room units have been constructed, one-room units, very small ones. But the water is so dirty that for the first time in my life, I went to somebody's home as part of my fieldwork, and they said to me, "I'm sorry, we're not going to offer you tea because you will not be able to take our water." It has never happened to me. Nobody's ever said that we can't offer you tea. But they said to me, "You won't be able to take our water." Indeed, the water was light yellow in color. And yet they live there. And they've been living there for a long time. So the point really is that they want to be known and recognized as citizens, whereas on the other side, those who are the attackers, the majority community, they come through as people of India. Now, if you look at the ways in which these ethnic conflagrations often happen, we must be careful to distinguish between two types of ethnicity. And if we broad brush them into one category, with doing them injustice, indeed, we will not make any headway in our own understanding of what is the meaning of justice in such situations. There's one kind of ethnicity which is also community marked, but that has to do with, shall we say, caste, religion, caste, language, borders, interstate borders, river water disputes, etc., where the combatants don't say that the other side is not Indian. There's another kind of ethnic conflict where the majority say that other side, they're not Indians, or they're not authentic Indians. They're not good Indians like us. They are in fact fifth colonists. They're agents of some other country, masquerading as normal people, but they're not. Watch out for that. This happened even with the Sikhs, by the way. When the Sikh killings took place in 1984, you wouldn't have thought that this kind of charge would be leveled against the Sikhs, because the Sikhs were supposed to be the sword arm of Hinduism. They were supposed to be the fighters, they were the army. They fought this war 62, 65, 71, and yet in 85, many of these Sikh bakers had no problems at all in casting Sikhs as anti-Indian, always straining at the leash for another partition. So that is a big thing. So you have ethnic movements of two kinds. One is of caste, language, etc., where the other side is not Indian, is Indian, but has been pampered unduly by the government, and the government should set things right. The scheduled caste has been pampered by the government, or certain linguistic group has been pampered by the government, and that has to be set right. So the government is the central theme. When, however, religious conflicts take place in India, particularly India because of the partition, is always the nation state which is at peril. It's not Maharashtra, Gujarat, Punjab, etc. is at peril, but the nation state itself is at peril, and we have to guard the nation state. Which is why this kind of ethnicity thematizes the nation state. Our borders are in peril. The people across the country who are out here to destabilize us from within, and that is the problem. Ernest Renan was a very well-known I can never pronounce his name properly because he's a French person, so there should be got a little R somewhere. So Ernst Renan said that there are just two options to us, left for us. We are either national or we are rational. We can't be both. And therefore, when you're national, you cannot be rational, and nobody even expects you to be rational, because nationalism is all about emotion that wells up from within because of history, tradition, bloodshed, war, conquest. All of that is figured into being a nation. So, we have problems defining what a nation. Eventually, we've come to the conclusion that a nation is a nation when it calls us a nation. End of story. But the fact is, being a nation state does not necessarily make you democratic. Democracy and nation states are not synonymous. They're not terms that you could easily interchange. You can be a nation state. Indeed, there are so many nation states, but are they democratic? They're not. Therefore, some of these nation states, the kind of question we're raising today about justice will not come up in the same way. Perhaps they'll talk about appeasement. Perhaps they'll talk about forgive and forget. Or maybe they'll even say, hard luck. You have to suffer it. You are the minority, we are the majority. Too bad. But in our country, we cannot say this because in our country, we talk about democracy. And therefore, the notion of justice comes up again and again. So it is not just being a nation state. That is not good enough. Because you're a nation state, India is a nation state. I remember Tagore in his arguments with Gandhi, for example, he said you would never sacrifice humanity at the altar of nationalism. And I think that is the ultimate point you can make in favor of democracy. So democracy and justice, I was just talking to a friend a little while back, and he said, but what are the chances of getting justice in India or anywhere for that matter? I said, it may be very low. But as a Democrat, as a citizen of a democratic country, it is your duty to ask for justice, even though you're probably on the losing side. But you have to do it, or else you have to accept the fact that yours is not a democratic society, and indeed, you are not a Democrat either. You have to accept that fact. Therefore, democracy, again repeat, is something that we prize. Some of us prize consciously, some of us don't realize the important elements that are in it. But at the end of the day, we must also know that being a nation state is very easy. Upholding democracy is very difficult. Democracy is not an easy job. Nobody said it was easy. Anyone who tells you it's easy is a liar. Democracy is a very difficult thing because democracy is very artificial, democracy is very contrived, and therefore to be able to sustain this delicate plant, you must be on your guard all the time. And asking for justice at this point, or about Gujarat or about any other place where people have suffered, unpardonable kind of ravages, is simply because we believe that democracy is difficult and democracy should be guarded, has to be protected. And that is why we are here. Let us all self-consciously and consciously, accept the fact that we are here because we feel that democracy has to be safeguarded. It is not a sociological law that a nation state should be a democratic state. There is no sociological law that says every nation. In fact, there are so many nation states in the world today that are not democratic nation states. Therefore, if you want to make yours a democratic nation state, remember, it's a tough job. But what are the specifics of Gujarat that we're talking about? What I also learned in my study was that there are Muslims and Muslims. The way in which we tend to talk about Muslims as a category is not quite right. You have seen that in the recent UP elections. You see that in some very quick readers of the Sachar Committee report. And on an everyday basis, we talk about the Muslim vote, the Muslim mind, the Muslim temperament. And let me tell you that in my own understanding, and there's good evidence for it, there are indeed Muslims and Muslims. They're all Muslims, but not the same kind. There are different kinds of Muslims, there are different backgrounds, there are different ambitions, and there are different problems. And when I was studying Bombay, Mumbai, and Ahmedabad, in the context of what happened in these two places in different points of time, I realized this very, very vividly. The Muslims of Bombay reacted very differently from the Muslims of Ahmedabad. And if you want me to talk about it later, I shall talk about it because I think it's worth discussing, but I won't let that intrude upon the main subject of today's discussion. One point, however, has to be made. What Gujarat taught me, I should have learned it earlier, but we are always slow on the uptake. What Gujarat taught me was that the rural poor are not necessarily pure. In the past, we always felt that the rural people are, where honesty and everything resides naturally. And I found in my study, and you all know, the kind of brutality that Muslims faced in rural Gujarat. And there were rural Gujaratis who inflicted all that upon them. And not just rural Gujaratis, there were many tribals who did that. In fact, there's a term that came up during those days, it was called Ramayan Bheels. Bheels who were coached in Ramayana. And before that also, in 1987, in Birupur, for example, there was an incident of this kind happening in Gujarat. So let's put that also out of the picture, that you can be poor, but you need not necessarily be pure. The other thing about Gujarat is very interesting. This is the only state I can think of, and you can correct me, I'm open to persuasion. The only state I can think of where the ruling dominant agrarian caste calls itself a Baniya caste. The Patidars claim to be Baniyas. In no other part of India does the rural dominant agrarian caste consider itself to be merchant caste. They claim to be warrior caste of one kind or the other. No matter how dubious their claims may be, they say we are warrior caste. Kurmi, Koiri, Yadav, Jat, Shastras, anybody you take across the board, Marwas in South India, anywhere. They all say they're some kind of Rajputs. But not the Patidars, the Leuda and the Karwa Patidars, they don't say so. They say they're Baniyas. Of course, there is a history behind that. They initially wanted to be Kshatriyas, then Kshatriyas faced a downturn, their fortunes, the Baniyas did well, so that they junked all their Kshatriya records and brought Baniya ones instead, and now call themselves Baniyas of one kind or the other, in a very broad way. But the interesting part is that these Patidars are not just rural people. They're rural and urban. They're rural, urban, and international. So they are carriers very often of an ideology which is urban but goes to rural India, to rural Gujarat. Because as we know, the first seeds of communal ideology were actually planted in urban India, from which it went to rural India. In Gujarat, probably the transition was smoother because the Patidars straddled both rural and urban India, and not just that, they had probably a finger across the seas as well, which is why it makes them quite a daunting community, especially if you want to take the bomb. The other thing is that in Gujarat, the faith-based organizations, whether it's Jamaat Islami or Jamaat Ulema, they played a very important role in the rehabilitation of the victims of Gujarat. So their alarm bells start ringing. They played an important role, so the people of Gujarat, the victims of Gujarat, will necessarily become fundamentalists. Hold it, not true. I'll come to that later. But in Bombay, you didn't find faith-based organizations playing that kind of a role at all. It was very different. In fact, Jamaat Islami played no role at all, very minor role in some parts of the city. As one Jamaat Islami leader, spokesman told me, this is also because we were a banned organization at the time. But in Gujarat, and if you take Ahmedabad or Odisha or Baroda or wherever, the bulk of the work in rehabilitation was done by Muslim faith-based organizations, primarily Jamaat Islami and Jamaat Ulema. This is something that many quote-unquote secular NGOs don't like to hear, but it is the truth. I remember when I went to Gujarat in 2002, there was this Gujarat Sarvajanik Relief Committee, I think it's called GSRC, which is an offshoot of the Jamaat Ulema, the Islamic Relief Committee, which is an offshoot of Jamaat Islami. Well, these organizations were active there, and many NGOs were trying to run them down and call them mullah-based organizations, so on and so forth. Right or wrong, the fact of the matter is that the bulk of the work was done by them. Shah Alam Mosque, you might remember, was where most of these victims took refuge. And the Shah Alam Mosque was supported to a large extent by these faith-based organizations. More than that, what should also be kept in mind is that these faith-based organizations actually helped in setting up refugee colonies for those who have been ousted from their homes. A study was done during the period when these victims were in different refugee camps, and I was surprised that 93% of them said, we will not go back to our earlier homes. Of course, that was not true. Many went back, But that fear was so intense that 93% said, we don't want to go back ever. Usually you might say, I don't want to go back now till the storm blows over, till the fires are doused. You say that, don't you? Times are bad, I'll wait it out. But 93% saying we don't ever want to go. And rural Gujarat particularly, the fear was much greater than urban Gujarat, because in rural Gujarat, many Muslims felt completely unsupported. There was no backup, and so they felt threatened, vulnerable all the time. Nevertheless, it was the state-based organizations that set up these homes in different parts of Ahmedabad and elsewhere in Gujarat. I only say Ahmedabad carefully, so I will talk about Ahmedabad only. Set up these homes, as I told you earlier, they're not the best of places to live in. Some of the sites chosen was really, really bad, probably because they didn't have enough money, probably because nobody wanted to give them the land. As you know, Modi wasn't a great friend of the victims in those days or even now, because he didn't want any relief to be sent to these camps. He said a camp will only get relief if it has running water, etc., etc. If you have running water, why do you need relief? That question was never asked. So these people had to fend for themselves, and the only organizations stood by them were the faith-based organizations. Like it or don't like it, but that is the truth. Now, what are the lessons we've learned 10 years on? As I mentioned to you, there's the economic lesson, education, and that regarding religious ideology. On the economic front, it's very interesting. In my own study, I found that about 80% said that they are worse off than what they were before. In Bombay, it was less. Bombay was 60% said so. But interestingly enough, about 40% of the victims in Ahmedabad found their old job back. It took time. It wasn't easy. It took time, but they got their old job back. I was discussing this with Nawab Malik. Some of you may know him. He was a minister in your state government till recently. He still is probably a minister. Nawab Malik? Is he? Anyway, Nawab Malik, I met him in Bombay, and he said that you can't keep a good Muslim down for too long. Yeah. The reason simply is that your air conditioner will need repairing. Your motor car will blink one day, and you'll have to repair it. You'll have radio problems, aerial of your television, or any number of issues at home. You'll have to come to us. We are the ones who do this kind of work, which is right. 93% of Muslim workers are in the informal sector, compared to 80% amongst the Hindus. 23% of Muslims are salaried, compared to 35% who are salaried amongst the Hindus. 40% of Muslims are for some land, compared to 60%, 57% amongst the Hindus. 5.8% Muslims have a job in the formal sector, compared to 12.3% amongst Hindus. Now you might say 7% difference here, 13% difference there. What's the big deal? But remember, this is 11% of the population. And remember also the vast numbers we're talking about. Quantity sometimes yields to quality. The vast numbers we're talking about. So what we see is that on an everyday basis, generally speaking, I'm not saying that every Muslim, but generally speaking, Muslims are in the informal sector. They are primarily in what is called own account household enterprise. That is, they're weaving, or they're doing block printing, or they're doing zari work, or something or the other. Or as I realized, they also do agarbatti, this incense sticks. Little children, 5 years old, rolling out agarbattis in some of these so-called relief colonies. So they do all the jobs of this kind. So it's a rather cruel thing to say, perhaps, but most Muslims moved from one poverty to another poverty. They were poor earlier, they're poor again. And you might even say, to put a cynical ring to this rather thoughtless statement, that it is easier for a poor person to get back to status quo ante than for a well-to-do person. And that is the way I saw it, and that's the way they saw it. So 10 years later, 10 years back, they were talking about no jobs. 10 years later, they were telling me, well, we don't have the best job. We have a problem. I have to travel from Citizen Nagar to somewhere else to work. And that's a long time. I have to spend money in bus or cycling or whatever, but I have a job. That's not really the thing that bothers them all the time, like we thought it would. We have a job of some kind, we're moving from job to job. They're also kind of, because of exigency and circumstances that force them to be multitaskers. They're good at many things, but not excellent at them, but good at many things. So I found one person who was a radio repairman, he became a panwala. Another person who had a taxi became a mechanic. Somebody who had a truck, in fact, poor chap, now is a truck repair person. Sometimes extraordinary things. A tailor becomes a watch repair person. They can really move into a number of professions, because all these professions don't require heavy duty skills. They just require aptitude, willingness to learn, and the urge to bring home some money. So they're willing to do a number of things. So they move horizontally, as it were, from one poverty to another poverty to another poverty. And it's something they've been doing all their lives. The riots happened. It was dreadful because it broke the peaceable nature of their everyday lives. But when they returned again to the economic front, it was not that bad. It was bad, but not that bad. Not as bad as we saw it when the riots happened. They've been able to stabilize themselves somewhat. As I told you, 40% got back their old jobs. So it's bad. Many of them travel long distances. They're poorer than what they were before, but they have a job. When it comes to education, the story is very different. Very, very different. Because while the schools have opened, while the Jamaat Islami and the Jamaat Ulama have set up schools, in fact, the first schools set up in many of these riot-hit colonies were set up by faith-based organizations. The Ikra school, for example, in Narod-Patia, which you have gone to, that was set up by the Jamaat Ulama, Jamaat Islami, the Islamic Relief Organizer Committee. So many of the schools were set up by them, and they told me that we set up these schools because we thought, and rightly so, that this is the best way of easing them into some kind of normalcy. Because children have to go to school. Children don't go to school. It hurts you every day. You see your children sitting at home. They can't go to school. So by sending children to school, not the best school, but a school, is one way of making the transition. Of course, I must say, while talking about it, it occurred to me, the other thing they also said was the NGOs helped them a lot, because while they didn't provide them with housing and food and so forth, the mere fact of being able to negotiate with the state apparatus by going to the courts, by filling in forms, asking for compensation, that itself made them move out of home with some degree of security, and that also helped them to regain some kind of balance after they've been so brutally attacked. So you have schools there that are an issue. They abuse these step schools. But what I found very interesting, and in contrast to Bombay, is that both the Jamaat Islami and the Jamaat Ulama set up schools in the Gujarati medium, not in Urdu medium, in Gujarati medium. What is more, this demand was actually, you might say, a felt need. The Muslims of Gujarat, in Ahmedabad in particular, said, we want Gujarati medium schools. You might say it is fear, it probably is. As one mother told me, galat se Urdu ka lafaz na nikal aaye. They didn't want the children, when they talked to other Gujaratis, to see them as anything but Gujarati, as long as, of course, the name is not mentioned. So Gujarati medium was most important, of course, English medium. But nobody wanted to do Urdu. Urdu was not there, though they spoke Hindustani at home, many of them. The Narod-Patia Muslims are from Karnataka, most of them, but even in Narod-Patia, there were a large number of Muslims who came from North India. Elsewhere in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, many of the Muslims, most of the Muslims are migrants. They're not actually Gujarati Muslims, they come from elsewhere. And Hindustani is their lingua franca. But they don't want to learn Urdu in their schools. There is, in fact, there are Anjuman schools in Ahmedabad, very well established, properly constructed, regular Anjuman schools. You know what Anjuman schools are? Anjuman schools where it is forbidden to speak Urdu. It is forbidden. And only girls in between class 9 and 11 have the option of taking Urdu classes. But in school final, it has to be Gujarati, stroke English. Boys, interesting, do not have that option. Only girls are given that option, not boys. The emphasis there is every child in the Indian schools that they should learn Gujarati. As that woman said, when they speak to you, you should not be able to make out that they're not from Gujarat. They're not as Gujarati as you are. So this is a very interesting thing. Whereas in Bombay, nobody wants, Muslims by and large don't want to send their children to Marathi medium schools. They either go to Urdu medium schools or they go to English medium schools. Here there's English if you're better off, but by and large, it is a Gujarati medium school that they're talking about. But unfortunately, a large number of Muslims are also afraid of sending their children to the best school in the neighborhood because that school is located in a Hindu area. And this has happened in many of these colonies. Because in Hindu areas, therefore don't send their children to those schools. In some cases, the Subvert Shiksha Abhiyan has made some inroads and they've set up schools, very, very rural elementary schools, but schools nevertheless. But the properly established schools, Gujarati medium, are not in these places but in Hindu areas. And as you would imagine, there is a huge shortage of instructors in the Gujarati medium because there is such a huge demand for it. Everybody wants to learn Gujarati or English, but Gujarati is more affordable than English. So when it comes to school, we find this is a big difference. They want education, but they want education of Gujarati language so that they can prosper with the rest and not be where their parents are. This is an aspect which is true of rural India and urban India. Parents, by and large, poor parents, by and large, don't want their children to be where they are. Their parents didn't quite think that way, but the current generation of poor people are thinking in aspirational terms, which is why all of this is being calculated by them on an everyday basis. The last most interesting point is that of religious clerics and the hold of the religious virtuosos. As I told you, the FBOs, faith-based organizations, were the ones who built these homes. Nobody else was doing it for them. They built them. They set them up. They did ask them for something in return. They didn't say you have to go to the Jamaat, to the masjid every week. They said at the time, no demands. You don't have to come with us for any procession. No demands. Of course, homes were limited. Many seekers, few of them got these homes, but there was no demand made on them. I've asked this question from a number of people, and not one has told me that we got this home on condition that we behave like quote-unquote good Muslims thereafter. Not one has said that to me. But some interesting developments have happened anyway. And this happens, I think, when people get to know each other well, or they have to deal with each other for a long period of time. The Muslim residents of a place like Citizen Nagar, for example, are very upset with the Jamaat Islami. Though the Jamaat Islami, found them these homes, they're upset with them, saying we don't have water, we don't have electricity, we don't have this, that, and the other, and what is mullahs doing? They're just going out getting money and doing nothing for us. And there's something called Durabji Yatim Khana, which has 30 units there, which had 30 units there, and that organization gave these units to the residents and said, this is yours. The Jamaat Islami is not giving us ownership papers to these units. And hence, there's a lot of animosity against those very people who actually made the homes for them. And I talked to the Jamaat Islami people, they said, we can't give them ownership papers because we don't want this to be rented out, and people to sell it and be part of some market, real estate market. We don't want that to happen. So we are holding back. So you see, they have some justification. But from the point of view of the residents there, they are very upset. If those 30 people get ownership papers, why can't we? Then I'll give another example from Ramola, just because I want to be fair to all the faith-based organizations. This is run by the Jamaat Ulema. And in my book, which has been published but not readily available, I think, I have some photographs to show that there are row upon row of these units which are locked and have remained locked for years. And the residents of these colonies are hot and angry at those who gave them these units in the first place. They're saying that look at these residents, they're locked because the mullah there, the imam there, wants to make money by selling, by giving it to the highest bidder. And then they said worse things, but we won't talk about it. Then they said that he is Hitler #1. He is worse than the Hitler you and I know of. They were so angry. And once I touched this topic, it was difficult to contain them. The anger was overflowing. To be fair to Muslim organizations, the Tablighi Jamaat. The Tablighi Jamaat in Modasa ran up against this opposition from the local Muslims in Modasa. Because the Tablighi Jamaat said there's a right form of prayer and a wrong form of prayer. And you people are doing the wrong thing. You should do the right thing. This is the way you should pray. And they also said that the Sufis are bad news. Don't be persuaded by the Sufis. Now, most Muslims in Ahmedabad had a soft spot for the Sufis because of the Shah Alam Mosque that they found refuge. And Shah Alam Mosque is a Sufi mosque, a Sufi shrine. So to tell them that Sufis are not right, you are doing the wrong thing by being persuaded by them, or you don't pray the right kind of way, upset these Muslims so much that they stopped going to the mosque run by the Tablighi Jamaat. But adjacent to the mosque, using one side of the mosque as a wall, they set up this blue tarpaulin tents and said, this is our mosque, that is your mosque. And they refused to go to the established mosque. So the point I need to make is this fear that they're turning fundamentalists because the NGOs did this job for them, set up homes for them, or that the Hindus massacred them is not quite right. They are thinking people. As one person told me, to the unanimous acclaim of those who were around him, that these religious clerics, they're very good at things above the ground and below the ground, but not on the ground. And they all said, yeah, that's true. So the point is this, that if I had not gone 10 years later, I would not have known these things. If I had not gone 10 years later, I would have come up with the same impression that most people have. That is, these Muslims are ready for the picking. Fundamentalists can come anytime and sway them because they're so upset. It did happen in the early years. They did feel the need for community support. They feel it now, but they feel it in a very reasoned and sensible fashion. They're not swayed by fundamentalist diktat. In fact, the religious virtuosos are really quite upset. And if truth be told, the Jamaat Ulama wants the Muslims of Gujarat to forgive and forget. And they joined up with CARE, an international organization, which also put forward this point of view. But whenever I raised this with any Muslim that I knew, they would immediately reject it. One lady told me, Gagan Seth was a very important person. He's fought many cases for the Muslims. And he felt that we shouldn't waste our energies in taking minor matters to court. Let's concentrate on the big things. So we can flag march these big victories and psychological succor. But this lady tells me that how can I forget somebody's taken my refrigerator? He's drinking cold water and I'm here. Somebody's watching my television and I'm sitting in the dark. I'm not going to forgive these things. I want justice on every count. And poor Gagan said he was wit's end because then there were so many cases. What he wanted was a concentration of issues which all of them could then pursue and bring about some degree of justice and psychological hope to a number of people. So this is the story that I would like to tell you. So when you think of normalcy again, it's going to be another negotiated normal. But this normalcy should, I think, be aspired to in terms of citizenship and not in terms of forgive and forget. Because all of them have told me, I say all of them, I underline that. There may be others who have a different point of view, I did not meet them. All of them I met said, we are willing to forget, we want to forget. And the only way we can forget is if we get justice. If we get justice, we're the first people to forget. So they are willing and waiting to forget. Nobody wants to remember a terrible part of their lives. But what is holding them back is that they don't have the kind of support necessary, democratic support necessary to forget. So what kind of policy can we think of? I would say, of course, justice. I would also say, in line with this, all those places which have been ghettoized, and ghettoization is a reality, there's no point saying ghettoization is bad, it is reality, accept it, provide those ghettos with civic amenities. Because they don't have civic amenities, that hurt of not getting justice is magnified. I would also say, in line with this, to make economic opportunities available to them around the areas where they live. I also feel, taking a leaf out of the American system, the New York police, it is probably a good idea to have the police force in places like Ahmedabad, everywhere in India in fact, overrepresented by the minority community, as the police force in America is overrepresented by the blacks. Likewise, it wouldn't be a bad idea at all to entertain this possibility. So this is the main points I wanted to tell you, and perhaps we can discuss them later. But I want to end with this letter, which was written by Justice J.S. Verma, because he was the head of the National Human Rights Commission. He came to Gujarat and he toured the place, and his voice was very loud, very clear, and very honest. I'll read a few extracts from his letter, which he wrote to the Prime Minister. He said that whatever he has done so far is guided by two overarching principles. The first, to promote and protect human rights in a country with all of the vigor and integrity that our Constitution, laws and treaty obligations require. We should remain concerned as to whether the victims and those related to them by kinship or community will be allowed to avail in full measure of the legal and other remedies that should be provided to them. I would, however, like to observe with great respect that if our country should fall short of rendering justice promptly and effectively to the victims, that would be a serious travesty of justice. Regrettably, in spite of the recommendations made by this Commission, not enough has been done to assure the victims of the country. This letter was written to the Prime Minister. I turn to you, Mr. Prime Minister, both as the head of government and as a person with a deep and abiding understanding of the issue at stake, to express my anguish and hope you will act soon before you relinquish office. The Prime Minister who was talking to was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. But some things don't change. This could be written to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh as well. Thank you.